Okay, I'm going to talk about forage quality, and we'll start off right off the bat with what is forage quality, and I'm going to give the answer that they taught us to answer all questions in university with, and that's it depends. And I think that's really true with forage quality because it really depends on what we're doing with that forage, on what our end result is going to be, and matching the feed to the need. So why does this all matter? It's really all about performance and profitability. We'd really like to be able to allocate the forages to the groups of livestock based on their condition, based on their needs, optimize the use of any purchased forage or supplements, better value traded forages, whether you're buying or selling, and be able to compare those, and to compare management between species, varieties. There's a lot of value from the seed development side as well. First step, take a feed test. This is something Serena can probably help you with. I think the Forage Council has some probes that are willing to loan out to members. You want to identify a lot of hay by field, by cut. You want a representative sample. This means take a lot of cores. I recommend close to 20 to try to get some variation out of there. That might not be practical if you're dealing with wrapped bales. That's a lot of holes to poke and tape up, but try to do your best. I prefer using a smaller probe for dry hay in order to take more samples. It forces me to take more samples to get a large enough sample, and a larger probe for silage bales so that it doesn't plug up in the probe quite as bad. So we get the samples taken. You can see here's quite a spread from some quite immature second cut on the left over to some pretty coarse first cut on the right. Off they go to the lab, and we get some results back. It's just some examples. I know you probably can't read all those numbers. That doesn't matter. There's just a lot of information on there. And we're going to talk about that as I go through, what some of that means, what its implications are, and how we can match that up. Now, usually when the lab does forage tests, they use what's called NIR, that they grind it, dry it down, and it's the light passing through reflects back to a calibration that's been made for the type of forage that you tell them it is. And usually it can fit the curve really well. Sometimes it doesn't. So it's just something to be aware of. If it doesn't, then it's a good idea to go to wet chemistry, which is the more refined lab methods, to make sure it's an accurate result. So in order to talk about quality, I really need to talk about what do cattle require. And this is going to be really beef cattle focused. It's what I have the most experience with, although I have done work with dairy farms as well. So yeah, we'll build off of that. Hopefully it gives some more understanding. Hopefully some of this is old, but hopefully we build on it as well. So protein, we're often talking in crude protein, but what nutritionists use is metabolizable protein, which is the amount that's actually taken out of the digestive tract into the cattle and used. Energy, we're commonly thinking about TDN, but once again, we're often using a net energy calculation when we're figuring gains or lactation. Cattle also require fiber for proper rumen function, so we need to look at that. Minerals and vitamins, and of course water. I'm not going to get into those very much here. Start with protein, because that's what everyone wants to talk about first. And quite often it's like, well, when you're selling hay or buying hay, it's like, what's the protein of that hay? And I want to explain that there's a bit more to it than just straight protein, because protein's nitrogen percentage times 6.25, and it has a lot of different pathways within the animal. It can be quite degradable right away, or undegradable once it gets into the rumen. Where it's taken up it depends on that. And really the animal's needs, it doesn't have a need for protein directly, but it has a need for amino acids. And that's better calculated using the metabolizable protein system when you're balancing it or fine-tuning a ration. I mentioned feeding the rumen bacteria and the degradable versus undegradable protein. So some of it is broken down right away in the rumen, and the rumen bacteria, the bugs there, they'll feed on it, and they produce microbial protein. And that's perfectly balanced, right? This pretty well designed system, because that is perfectly balanced to the animal's needs in terms of an amino acid concentration. So with beef cattle, we're quite often looking to drive that microbial protein synthesis as much as we can. Different forages have different levels of degradable versus undegradable. I'll talk about that a little bit as we go forward. And there's different ways to supplement to better control that. Is there such thing as too much protein? For sure. Excess protein in the diet can cause issues with too much ammonia, which we can run into problems with breeding. It's also quite expensive in terms of an energy cost within the animal to handle that ammonia. So we want to try to avoid that. We could partially control that with good silage preservation techniques, especially in alfalfa. Fermentation gone wrong can cause high ammonia levels. We also look at bound protein, which is heat damaged. Here's a picture on the left of a bale that's quite caramelized on the inside. And we're able to see that on the feed results. And if it's quite bad, we might have to compensate for that in the ration, because that protein is not going to be available. It's tied up within the fiber in the feed. Not having enough protein, a deficiency, can result in reduced growth rate, reduced weight loss, reduced intakes, delayed estrus, poor conception. It can be impacts on unborn calves, on the imprinting on them. But none of it's very good. If you're short protein, cheapest ways to find some better quality forage to supplement it with. We can also use grains, canola meals, byproducts of the distilling industry. Urea can be a very useful product because it's high and degradable for feeding those rumen bugs quickly. Here's a couple of feed results. One is full bloom alfalfa. One is alfalfa cut at late bud. So you can see, I don't know if it'll be too laggy. I'll try to turn on the little pointer circle here. Okay, so we're looking at crude protein. Now with forage samples, we always want to look at percent dry matter. We want to take the water out of the equation. Then we can compare apples to apples. If it's silage bales, dry bales, or hey, that's a little bit wetter. So we can see we have a difference of about 10% protein versus 20% protein. Rumen degradable protein down near the bottom here, 60% of compared to 70% of the total crude protein is rapidly available. And alfalfa is really good for that. It has a great supply of rumen degradable protein, once again, to feed those rumen bugs, maximize microbial protein synthesis. Okay, I built a bit of a chart. It might cut off at the top if you're with your menu. It does on mine. Okay, the dark purple maroon one, that's mature cows. The orange one on the left is growing heifers, and percent crude protein as we go up. So we'll start with those three first: mid-pregnancy, late pregnancy, and after calving. You see how the increase in protein requirements go up, and you can see how it's higher for growing heifers, roughly up 2 percentage points. The blue one that's really short there, that's mature bulls. They don't require much. And then alongside that, more of a red color, is a 500-pound steer. And as you can see, as you want more gains, from half a pound to 1.5 pound to 2.5 pounds, the protein requirements jump quite a bit, from around 9% up to over 14%. Once if you're feeding yearlings, the protein requirements are lower, because as a percentage point, they're bigger animals, they're able to eat more. As a percentage, it's less, right? The requirement's not so much as a percentage, it's a requirement for pounds or grams of those amino acids of protein as a whole. So it gets diluted as the intake goes up with a bigger animal. Okay, I put just some examples of typical feeds on here. Early harvested grass compared to late harvested grass, early harvested alfalfa, late harvest alfalfa. Mixtures would be in the middle. So as you can see, if you're growing alfalfa, there's stands that are predominantly alfalfa or other legumes. In most cases, you're going to meet that animal's protein requirements, even if it's harvested late. Grass is where we get into a little bit more trouble. Late harvested grass can be deficient, and we need to look at ways to supplement that. Threw a few other things on here just for comparison. Cereal silage is pretty close. If it's harvested at the right stage, it meets the requirements most of the time. Corn silage is a little bit lower, and we got straw way down there. Next thing I'm going to talk about is energy. And to me, this one's almost more important than protein. I shouldn't say more important. Let's say just as important as protein, but it's not talked about as much. Okay. When we're looking at it, initially we'll look at TDN, total digestible nutrients. Now, we have to be a little bit careful with TDN because there are a couple different calculations for it. And depending which lab is reporting it, they may or may not handle it the same way. So you can compare two samples of TDN from the same lab, but between labs, you should be careful and make sure they're using the same equation. The net energy system is really the gold standard here for sorting out your energy. On a feed test, we break it down into the energy that's rapidly available, the energy that's slowly available. Rapidly available is your starch, your sugar, your fats. Slowly available is fiber, ADF and NDF, and they're measures of the cellulose, hemicellulose within the plant. Oh, here we have a couple more examples of feed tests, and the video screen might be in the way, so you guys might have to move that. It wasn't my computer. Once again, I have it broke out between the late bud and the full bloom alfalfa cuts, and TDN of over 60 at late bud, mid 50s at full bloom. You can see the net energy numbers, how they went down. The fiber levels went up. Once again, looking at the percent dry matter numbers, and the sugar levels, they're relatively similar. We won't worry about that too much in alfalfa because it's not a major component. Both these stands probably had a little bit of grass in them. Now, I'm sure everyone's seen something similar to this in the past. This is energy needs for a mature cow around 1,300 pounds calving sometime in March, and it just shows how those needs go up towards pregnancy, and then once it starts lactating, will peak actually about 2 months after calving, and energy requirement going up to over a 60 TDN at that peak. One other very important part is condition, and this is the importance of keeping your animals in good condition and monitoring what the condition is, because it's very expensive from an energy standpoint to put condition back onto animals, back onto cows. So this is leading up to calving. Say you come in and it's late fall and it's like, well, those cows are pretty skinny. We need to get them built up again before calving. If you want to do it quickly in 120 days, it's going to take a lot of energy. It's going to take 20-30% more energy, depending on whether they're just borderline or whether they're quite thin. And that would be 1 to 2 body condition scores off of the ideal. So best if you can keep them in condition. I know that's not always realistic depending on range conditions. Energy needs are also impacted by temperature, wind speed, hair depth, cleanliness. The lower critical temperature is the terminology that we use, and it's impacted by whether the animal has a dry coat and no wind, or wet snow on its coat. As you can see, dry coat -25 it can handle without major energy changes. Wet snow, that's only -7. And it takes about 2% more energy for every degree Celsius under the lower critical temperature. We also need to consider the increased intake needs in order to meet this. Here's my big graph again, this time for energy. And we can see it's similar to protein in that the growing heifers are going to require about 5% more TDN than mature cows, but we'll follow the same increasing curve. Mature bulls are once again quite low, 50% TDN, And intakes are really driven, or sorry, gains are really driven by the amount of energy provided, right? Where mid 50s might get you a half a pound average daily gain or 3/4 of a pound average daily gain. In order to get to that 2.5 pounds average daily gain, you should really be up near 70% TDN with calves, and mid 60s with yearlings. So it's really important energy. Now this is alfalfa, early harvested or late harvested. And here's where some mature alfalfa may fall a little bit short at some stages of the cow's cycle. But early harvested, if you have some early harvested available, whether it's a second cut or a third cut, is almost always going to meet the needs, other than really pushing for gains on those feeder type animals. Threw in a few more examples just so people could get a bit of a perspective of where other products fall on the energy scheme here, with rolled barley up in the 80s, corn silage is usually around a 70, and straw, what's it get, fairly low. But that's not being said that in a properly balanced ration with some high energy early harvested forage, we can still use some straw, still blend it in there to get us into the middle range, and possibly do that cost effectively. So if you're short energy, results in loss of body weight, once again, poor conception, declining growth and milk. Solutions, we can use different forages, decrease gains, or change the demand, right? If it's a recurring problem, you could look at maybe changing the calving date to match up with a different part, change your cropping system to have different forages in there, or early weaning if you're in the right time, because that'll change the energy demand there as well. Now, it wouldn't be complete without talking about feed intake. It's related to the capacity of the digestive tract. So animal size, class, what stage of production. Once that calf starts growing in there, it's going to reduce intake a little bit because it's taking up space too. Somewhere between 1.5% and 3.5% of body weight, but it's really driven by forage quality. There are some other influences, temperature, as we mentioned earlier, moisture of the feed. If the feed's extremely wet, that can drop it. Anti-nutritional factors, have weeds in there, or mold growth, mycotoxins. Any other issues can also cause the animals to back away from it. Now, I mentioned it's driven by forage quality, and in that, I mean, it's really driven by fiber, and in two components. Number one is rumen fill. So we mentioned the size of the rumen, the size of what's available, and the other one is the rate of passage, the digestibility of the feed. The feed test, we measure that as NDFD. And this is a really important component. It wasn't used years ago, and it's something that's come more into common use, I would say. Now, a lot of that's to do with nutritional models and the way nutritionists work with your rations and work with your forages. So fiber digestibility in the model is split into pools based on the speed of digestion. And there's some new feed terms you'll sometimes see on the test now. There's a ANDF, which is an improved version of NDF, because it adjusts it based on fiber that's bound up with protein, and UNDF, which is undigested NDF. So it's lignin plus some of the other undigestible fibers, rather than traditionally we would have looked just at lignin, but this is another number we can look at to see how much of the fiber is undigestible given the rate of passage of the animal. The fiber data that we get from the lab is quite extensive. ADF, NDF, lignin is still on the feed test usually. You can see we have a whole bunch of different fiber digestibility numbers with different time scales. 30 hours, 120 hours, and 240 hours are the ones we commonly use. 30 hours is what we consider the fast pool. 120 is considered the slow pool, and 240 is kind of the entire residence time within the animal. So it gives us an idea what the total digestion of that fiber is going to be. and then we have UNDF. So in this example, the full bloom alfalfa had a UNDF 240 of about 23% of dry matter. So 23% of that fiber came, or 23% of dry matter of what was fed came back out as manure. Now, there's also a section of comparative calculations. Talked about TDN a little bit and the different calculations related to that. RFV, really only good for straight alfalfa. So I prefer that producers look at RFQ as a way to compare forages. It's an improved version of RFV. It takes into account digestibility values. So you can readily compare different lots of hay or different stacks of hay. To give you an idea, typically a beef cow will need somewhere around 100 to 110 RFQ. A high production dairy cow, we're looking for that number to be more like 150. Another number is milk per ton that shows up on a number of feed tests. Often it's used for corn silage, but there's also a formula for alfalfa grass in here, and it can be useful to compare two different forages. Also useful if you're using yield data, because you can multiply it by your yield and find out a total amount of milk per acre, and that can be really good to compare different treatments. So we have our calculations here. You'll see down at they're kind of midway down the bottom of this, right? The full bloom alfalfa was around 100 relative feed quality, and the late bud at 176. So that would have been very good dairy hay. Another number that comes up on here is non-fiber carbohydrates, and I didn't talk about this too much before. That's something else we look at, and quite often we want to balance that with the amount of protein that's degradable to make sure there's enough energy to feed those rumen bugs. So we're comparing feed tests. First look, just a quick glance over. We'll look at dry matter, protein, ADF, NDF, the fiber levels, fiber digestibility, and then TDN or net energy, depending which one most comfortable with, and relative feed quality and ash. I didn't talk a lot about ash, but it's the total of all your minerals within that forage plus dirt that ends up in there. And sometimes if a feed test doesn't look quite right, that ash level can be quite high. A whole bunch of dirt ended up in there, whether it's from molehills or cutting really low or raking it in there unintentionally. It definitely can happen. We have a closer look at feed tests, and this is something that a nutritionist would be doing, fine-tuning a ration. We'll look at the protein detail, whether it's soluble, degradable, bound up, detail within the carbs, starch and sugar levels, more detail within the digestibility. We'll also look at the fermentation profile. And this is given when you send a silage sample into most labs, and it'll show you what the pH is. Generally, we want a low pH. It'll show you what that ammonia level is I mentioned with the alfalfa, and it'll show you which volatile fatty acids are present within the silage. There can be some concerns around here if the silage is too butyric. There can be a lot of production issues feeding butyric silage. That's the really stinky stuff. And there's a number of causes for that. I won't go into those probably in this, because that would take a while too. Then of course there's minerals. Once again, outside of the scope of this talk. So as I've tried to explain there, forage quality I think is really important, and it's something we should be looking at a lot. Now, what drives that forage quality? Stage of maturity is number one. Species and genetics can be a large factor. Environment and agronomy. Environment we can't control too much, but it definitely changes it. Agronomy we can change. Harvest management, we have a lot of influence over that. Now, these aren't very scientific. I drew them in paint, but they give a good indication of kind of where the levels go, right? So vegetative through to mature with alfalfa, see yield goes up, fiber level goes up, digestibility slowly moves down, Energy moves down fairly linear, and protein drops away. So we'd like to be somewhere in that range most of the time to be effective. And but it might be a little bit too good of feed for some production, some stages of the animals. If we go back to the chart I had a while ago, but you can always mix it with some feed that's not quite as good. Comparing grass to alfalfa, grass of course is going to have lower protein and more fiber, but it makes up for it with better overall digestibility and more energy from sugars. It has a larger slow pool and less undigestible. So we find that having a little bit of grass in there really can help with rumen function. And this is important with really high production animals in that it helps buffer the pH within the rumen, helps prevent acidosis issues. We've seen a lot of interest in feeding a little bit of grass in high production dairy cows, especially, but it improves quality across the board in that way. Downside with grass is that it does lose quality quicker than alfalfa. So in a wet year where harvest gets delayed, it can really hurt you there. I put a cereal silage on here just because they behave a little bit differently. As we move from boot stage through to soft dough and mature, energy starts out fairly high, actually drops a little bit, but then as the grain builds up and we start to build starch in there, energy level actually increases again. So with cereals, we're looking either to harvest it quite early before boot stage to treat it really as an immature grass plant, or we're looking to harvest it at that soft dough stage in order to maximize the use of the energy. Other growing influences, interactions between species and variety. We can have higher and lower feed quality depending on species and depending on variety. Certainly within grasses, there was mention earlier about red clover and how the protein's a little bit different within red clover. That's definitely the case, and some of the legumes would fall into that category as well. Environment is another one. A lot of the producers in central BC, we benefit from long days, cool nights. That is overall beneficial for energy level. And warm, wet weather, detrimental. Sunny days are definitely good, but not too hot. Okay. Agronomic, adequate fertility is important. Having enough sulfur is important for protein synthesis within the plant. That little picture is a boron deficient plant. It's not looking too healthy. Those leaves aren't going to contribute much value. Pests and disease are something we need to watch out for. Alfalfa weevil will take the leaves right off. That's a picture of a barley crop on the right that had a stripe rust problem, and as you can see, a lot of the green leaves have turned brown lower in the stand. Harvest management. It's really key that we aim for rapid dry down, because until respiration stops, the plant is still burning off energy. So we want to maximize that as quickly as possible by laying out wide windrows or utilizing a tedder if that's the case. There's some diurnal variation. Energy levels are higher in the evening, but it really depends on your exact location how this would work in BC, because if it's just going to sit there respiring longer because you cut it at night, and if you would have cut it early in the morning and had it quit respiring, you might be in the same place anyway. Ash, I already mentioned that briefly. That can be detrimental overall. Cows don't grow and don't produce milk on dirt. Silage, a whole other large topic, but the keys are optimum moisture for the crop and type, whether you're putting into a bunker, a bag, or bales. Exclude oxygen, proper packing, proper chop length, proper moisture ties into that as well. Cover it quickly and maintain it. And with some crops, it's really important to use an inoculant to help that fermentation process move effectively and move quickly. Feeding management, always think of it as there being multiple rations on every farm. There's the one that's formulated, there's the one that actually ends up being put in front of the cattle, and then the one that they actually eat. So we need to monitor moisture content, what they're not eating, what they're sorting out, what they're leaving behind, and also what their manure looks like. And you can really tell a lot from the consistency of the manure and what you're seeing in there and what you're not, as to how well they're digesting and what the protein level is. And I also put silage bunk management in here as an important component of feeding management, because you can cause yourself other problems with inappropriate bunk management from heating and introducing oxygen into that silage phase. Now, I threw this one on because I mentioned moisture checking, and this is the recommended easy way to do it if you don't have a Coster cooker. It requires a microwave. Don't use the one in your house because this can catch fire or it can stink. A scale, you want one that's in grams, and you want it to go down to 1 gram, not 5 grams. You want 1 gram to be accurate enough. Some sort of microwavable container. So you need about 200 grams of forage cut up. That's about half a pound, and put a glass of water in the microwave along with it. That should help prevent it from over drying and hopefully help prevent it from catching on fire. And the procedure is weigh it out on your tiered scale and record the wet weight. By tiered, I mean make sure you subtract out the weight of the microwave container. Microwave it for 2 minutes, weigh it again, and then microwave it for 30 seconds or a minute at a time, and keep weighing it. And once the weight stops changing, that's your dry weight. And it might take 15 minutes or 20 minutes of total. Some microwaves might not really like this. I had one that I was doing it with for a bit that once we put it on high, it kind of had a meltdown about 20 minutes in. So be prepared that this may wreck your microwave, but once you have one that works, it'll work good. And then here's the formula: moisture equals wet weight minus dry weight over wet weight times 100 to give you % moisture. So good little technique there, because moisture can change quite a bit, especially if you're feeding wet feeds, if you're feeding wrap bales, or you're feeding some sort of silage that was harvested over multiple days or multiple fields. And we're feeding them a bale, but what are they actually getting out of that? So in summary, important to feed test, group animals, get help from a nutritionist if needed, and if you want to fine tune it that far. Energy is just as important as protein. Fiber and digestibility will drive the animal's intake. I like to use relative feed quality and milk per ton to compare different forages, and then manage for the highest quality maturity, harvest, and feeding management. Okay, thank you.